I was having a wonderful day already, but
Now it's uplifted.
it's uplifted. This has to be the highlight of my week.
Well, it always is for me.
Really?
Whenever I am fortunate enough to see Tim, I I was the opening talking head where I told the story of Franklin Buchanan and to your cannons, to your guns, you will sink before surrender. And everyone goes, ah, and the film crew says, wow, can you do that again? I said, of course I can. And so they filmed me one more time, and yeah, I had something else for combat ships. Well, I've done three years. Okay. Greetings, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Mariners Museum. I am John Korstein. I'm Director Emeritus of the USS Monitor Center here at the Mariners Museum. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today, you actually can come to the Mariners Museum and see those relics relating to that battle that changed naval warfare forever. Often when we think about the Battle of Hampton Roads, we really don't see anything but the Monitor and the so-called Merrimack or Virginia. Since I'm talking mostly about Northern officers and so forth today, I'm going to use Merrimack more often because that's what they would have said. But I have to tell you, there are all these other ships involved in the battle, and they are also of great import. And so I decided to start talking about them, and I'll do so throughout the year, not every time I lecture, but enough. And so the ship that I think we have to realize is so critical to March 9th engagement is the USS Minnesota. And I have to tell you, the Minnesota is only going to survive as a result of the arrival of the USS Monitor. Now, I want you to look in the background of this. This is a new clicker, so look. See that? That's a paddle wheel. Now, paddle wheel warships, they could go anywhere you wanted. They had a great flaw. That flaw was one shot into a paddle box, and you were virtually dead in the water. So the U.S. Navy, in all its wisdom, decided in 1854 to begin to build what are called steam screw frigates. And the Minnesota happens to be part of the Merrimack class of steam screw frigates, and it will be built at Washington Navy Yard on the Anacostia River. And the ship is actually laid down in 1854. It will finally be launched in 1857. Now, what makes this such a successful ship, or on paper, I have to say? Well, the United States had toyed with paddle wheels, and actually Matthew Galbraith Perry, the great explorer, or I guess, or diplomat who went to Japan, he actually took steamers with him, and he described the problems with them, that he knew that we had to go to a different generation of motive power, and that motive power is going to be the screw propeller. And so even though we have quite a few of these steam paddlers, building the Merrimack class was a great departure. Now, I want you to think about 1858. What is going on in 1858? Well, the build up to the Crimean War, where all these new technologies are going to be introduced into naval warfare. The United States doesn't really pay attention to what are called floating batteries. Instead, we put our money into the steam screw frigates. Now, I have to say that this is the man that designs them, John Lenthal, who was the chief naval constructor, and then he became head of the Bureau of Docks and Yards. Now, he is a ship designer. He actually is faced with a big problem. The problem being that he has to combine two different motive powers into one ship. Now, the problem with doing that is that your hull design for sailing ships has to be, a little shearer. For a steam powered ship, it has to be flatter so that the engine system can fit in there. So the challenge he had was trying to combine these two engine systems. And so Congress was extremely adamant that we use screw propellers. Screw propellers are, of course, invented by John Ericsson and Samuel Pettit Smith in 1839. We have to give it to both people, but so the Minnesota is built. It's a beautiful ship. I have to say that it is going to be part of a larger class, which is going to be including the Merrimack, Colorado, Wabash, Roanoke, and Minnesota. Now, Minnesota, eventually, what she'll look like is basically she's named for the Minnesota River, a tributary of the Mississippi. She is 264 feet, 0.9 inches in length. Her beam is 51 feet, 4 inches. Her draft is 23 feet, 10 inches. I'll just want to note you that is difficult to get to Washington with that type of draft. And so the big problem is that they had to make these ships with greater drafts to combine these two motive powers. So she had a normal sail rig. Her engine was a horizontal steeple back acting engine with 5 boilers producing 993 horsepower. Now, that's not a lot, but back then it was pretty amazing. Its speed with steam only was 5.9 knots, with sail and steam, 8.7 knots. So, despite the effort to make it into a real modern fast ship, guess what? They do not do so, right? And so, so the Minnesota's first commander is going to be this man, Samuel Francis DuPont. Y'all might remember him from the Mexican War, where he helped conquer the Gulf of California. We also know he's a member of the esteemed DuPont family. Actually, his uncle was the DuPont who made the gunpowder. And his father had another mill, but it failed. So that's why DuPont joined the Navy at age 11. And so, however, he got around it all by marrying his first cousin, daughter of the gunpowder DuPont. So, it works somehow. But nevertheless, he's quite a patrician. He's also a dynamic naval officer. And his first duty assignment is to take this man to China. Now, this man happens to be a William Bradford Reed, and he is a grandson of John Reed, Quartermaster General for the Continental Army, commanded by George Washington. He had a hard job. And so, actually, this man is a philosopher, he's a lawyer, he is a college professor, he is an author. And because he helped James Buchanan get elected as president in 1856, Buchanan kind of owed him a favor. And so the favor was, I'm going to name you as minister to China. And so the ship that took him over was the newest American gleaming ship, the Minnesota. And as a result of that, he goes and gets the Chinese to sign the Treaty of Tencin. And then they come back to America as soon as, China was in a big confusion. They had been beaten about by the British in the Second Opium War. There's actually this tremendous rebellion going on known as the Taiping Rebellion. So America really wanted to have this open door to China. And the beginnings of that was allowing Americans to trade without tariffs with China. And number two, that we could practice Christianity when we're in China, because Christianity was tied up into the Taiping Rebellion, believe it or not. In fact, at first it was a Christian movement, and then the head of the Taiping Rebellion said, "Well, I'm Jesus right here," and so he started taking opium, and the rebellion didn't work. So I have to say that Reed will later become a Southern sympathizer and falls out of failure. Of course, the Minnesota, after going on this huge cruise, will come back to Boston, where she'll go to the Charlestown Navy Yard, and that's where she'll be decommissioned and placed in ordinary. This is 1859. I just want to tell you one thing I forgot is that this class of vessels, usually a class of vessel, everyone is just alike. But in this case, it depended on which shipyard you were building, what engine builder you used. It defined how good or bad your ships would be. So they were similar, but not quite so. They could handle 60 guns, believe it or not. But typically, like the Merrimack had 40 guns, the Minnesota had 47 guns, the Roanoke had 42 guns. So you can see this great difference in the class. But they all had one thing in common. They had bad engines. The only ship that actually had good engines, the two, were the Wabash and the Minnesota. And because they had, a different style of triple expansion engine. So that makes them very, very special. So, oh my gosh, it's in ordinary up at the Charleston Navy Yard, and all of a sudden the war breaks out. And this man is going to be placed in command of what we call the Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Now, no one realized at that time just how expansive the blockade was going to have to be. And so, as a result of it, we just have one to cover the entire Atlantic. While he's in command of the Atlantic blockading squadron, actually Francis DuPont, Charles Henry Davis, and a few other men would be in charge of the Naval Blockade Strategy Board. And so things will change. But when Stringham takes command, he will actually name the Minnesota as his flagship. And so, because he recognizes it's a huge ship and it had a platform with, now the gunnery on the Minnesota included 24 9-inch Dahlgrens, 14 8-inch Dahlgrens, and then 2 Dahlgren 10-inch shell guns on pivot. In other words, they had pivot guns fore and aft. And so we'll get to that in a little bit. So that gave even greater power. So this broadside that this vessel could offer would be really pretty powerful. It'd be close to 23 guns firing at an object. Well, this is pretty good. So anyway, the Minnesota was recommissioned on May 2nd. She's sent down right to Hampton Roads. And so the war's on, right? And so the Minnesota is in Hampton Roads with a couple of steamers or paddlers, Susquehanna, the Monticello, but also the Cumberland and then the Minnesota itself. The Minnesota is going to have Stringham, Silas Horton Stringham. Now, Stringham is a great naval hero. He was on board the USF President when they fought the Little Belt, the Belvedere. He served under John Rogers. He is in command of a ship of the line known as the Ohio during the landings at Veracruz. So he actually had been commandant of the Gosport Navy Yard in 1851, then again in 1854 through 1859. So he understood ships. He understood the modern ships because while he's in charge of the Gosport Navy Yard, they produced two of these steam screw frigates, the Colorado and the Roanoke. And they only had one dry dock, so the Colorado's in the dry dock. The Roanoke is built on stays. And when they launched the ship, it sank. And so that wasn't good for that boat. But nevertheless, so while the Minnesota is in Hampton Roads, it's not there for any reason but to begin the blockade of Hampton Roads. And you think about controlling the mouth of the Chesapeake, the commerce back then was mostly by sailing ship. And so the Confederates thought, oh, we'll just keep sending our ships down. Everything's going to be happy. Well, it just happens that the commander of building the fortifications for the defense of Norfolk, General Walter Gwynn, who's a graduate of West Point class of 1822. He's internationally known as a great railroad engineer. So when, of course, we have the differences between the North and the South, he joins the Confederates. He's there at Norfolk, and all of a sudden he realizes that the Minnesota, steam-powered, is able to stop all these sail-powered ships trying to get out of the Chesapeake Bay. And so Walter Gwynn complains. He says, why are you stopping all of our ships? And so actually Stringham tells him, well, we're at war. And when you're at war, we have to take advantage of our naval superiority and stop your trade. We're in charge of the shipping lanes. You're not. And so all of a sudden, the first successful blockade of the Civil War is brought out by the USS Minnesota. Minnesota is actually commanded by this gentleman, Captain Gershon Jacques Henry Van Brunt. And he was a real old salt. He served on Lake Erie during the War of 1812. He had also served during the Mexican War. He had served against the Barbary pirates. He had everything going for him. So that's why he's placed in the command of the newly recommissioned Minnesota. And so Stringham, right, during this early part of the war, Stringham is concerned about, we got to capture southern ports. And the first port that they really want to capture is in Florida. However, the Confederates had been really tricky. And so at Hatteras Inlet, they have the Hatteras lights so they can spot out into the ocean. They could slip out with steamers and capture all these northern merchantmen coming south or back up. And so that was great. They capture that coffee and whatnot. I think this was really a tremendous opportunity. By the way, I forgot to tell you, the Minnesota had captured 20 blockade runners just in a 3-month period. Stringham tells the Blockade Strategy Board that, the big problem is Hatteras, and we need to stop this commerce raiding. And commerce raiding is something that is growing bigger and bigger in the Confederacy. As a result of that, the Minnesota will be used. This is the type of ships that the Minnesota would be capturing, you know, schooners, and you know, if you got a steam powered ship and they're becalmed, you get to capture it. And so basically, well, wait a second, I missed a slide. There we go. I'm only so adept at slideshows, you know. But you can see the Confederates realize how important Hatteras Inlet is, and so they're going to build two forts, Fort Hatteras, Fort Clark, guarding the entrance to Hatteras Inlet. Stringham organizes an amphibious operation. He uses 800 troops organized by Benjamin Franklin Butler. And Butler, of course, we can boo. He is, you know, a shifty politician and a shyster lawyer. But nevertheless, he gets to become Major General, and he insists on commanding the units going down with Stringham. Now, that's a big mess. But what Stringham does is something that had not been seen in American naval warfare. Because I got steam engines, you know, coastal defense positions were really great because you would have to sail past those forts and you'd have to bombard those forts. So that's why you have Fort Monroe that you might be all interested in, and built of brick and stone. They were pretty good to stop these ships. Ships and their guns changed, and so that's another story. But what's going to happen here is that Stringham puts his ships in a circulus line. It actually is an oblong circle, so that the Minnesota tows the Cumberland, the Wabash is there, the paddlers Monticello is there, Mount Washington are there, and so this rotation is really great. Why? As those heavier ships make that curve and have their target, they can fire their broadsides. Then as they pass, going back through the circuit, they can reload, so that these forts, sand forts, designed by Walter Gwynn, are worthless. They cannot deal with the Navy. Now, Butler lands some troops. Actually, this is a naval victory, even though Butler has a better press corps. And so, you know, it was his victory. But actually, this is really, I think, this strategy is the exact strategy that we're going to see used at the capture of Port Royal Sound. Actually, that's the strategy that Farragut wanted to do at Mobile once he got past through the entrance to the bay. So, but the Minnesota is, of course, going to be in position back in Hampton Roads. He becomes commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. And so as a result of that, he is commander when the big event happens. That's right, the emergence of the CSS Virginia. Now, let me just tell you, you know, Van Brunt is quite a hero. And so, and he is, you know, he wants to fight. And all these naval officers, all they thought about was fighting. So right before the emergence of this ship, right, Van Brunt is going to write Gideon Wells, the Merrimack is still invisible to us, but reports says that she's ready to come out. I sincerely wish she would. I'm quite tired of hearing of her. The sooner she gives us the opportunity to test her strength, the better. Now, this is a wooden ship saying, come on, ironclad. Now, that's not real smart. But so, anyway, on the first day of the battle, the Minnesota is actually anchored off of Old Point Comfort. And so, and this is, of course, the Merrimack It won't go back. Well, so what happens is that the Virginia goes and sinks the Cumberland, the Congress. While that's happening, you see the commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron is in North Carolina with Burnside during the Roanoke Island expedition. So his thing to tell all his men, if that monster comes out, you just circle them and bound them with your guns. Now, you think, well, that might work, but most of the steam screw frigates, because there are two in Hampton Roads, the Roanoke, 42 guns, the Minnesota, their biggest gun is a 10-inch shell gun. So, in other words, they don't have the armament to really deal with the plate of the Virginia. Nevertheless, so during the March 8th engagement, what's so funny is, so the first ship that gets under steam, because as Ashton Ramsey said, oh my gosh, as we came into Hampton Roads, all of a sudden I saw all the signal flags, because actually Saturday was a wash day in the U.S. Navy, and so they had to take all that down. They put up signal flags. Then they had to, like, their engines fires were banked, so they have to get their fires up, and then they get tugs to help move them towards Newport News Point, where this ship is sinking Congress and the Cumberland. So on the way there, they try to cut a corner right off of what's called Salters Creek, Newport News Bar, and run aground. So the next ship that comes is the Roanoke, and it takes a wider berth, but it just so happens to run aground on the middle ground shoal. And then comes another one, the 50-gun St. Lawrence, and it also runs aground actually on the Hampton Bar, which is on the other side of Salters Creek. So here are these big ships, they're powerless. So when the Virginia does its business with the two sailing warships, it's going to head towards the Minnesota. The big problem is that the Minnesota is in a disadvantage. She has run aground so badly that she can't move at all. They have several tugs that are being assigned to, one of them the Dragon. But as the Virginia goes back into Hampton Roads and sees those ships, she starts sending shells. The first shell will strike the forward quarter of the Minnesota, starting a fire. So the big problem is that the Virginia, the tide's going out, darkness is coming, so it only can fire so much at these Union ships. Now, the Roanoke, when she gets off the middle ground, she goes back to Fort Monroe. So she skedaddles, and so Van Brunt's there with his ship, and the St. Lawrence will get off the shoal later that evening, but still gets a few hits. So the next morning, March 9, 1862, is the big opportunity my slide clicker is not working, Tim. So anyway, we'll catch that up. So in the morning of March 9th, now what had happened that night? Well, I want to tell you, the USS Monitor will arrive. And I think I'm doing it right. It's brand new.
Good technology. Just what you need.
What did I do wrong?
Oh, I just reset it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. That's what Tim's great for. We should give applause to Tim, our hero. So anyway, this is the sinking of the Cumberland, of course. And so as you see in the far background is the Minnesota, right? The object of the day is to, when the monitor arrives, it is kind of a shocking experience. The monitor comes in, goes next to the Roanoke. John Marsden's in command of the squadron. So he said, go save the Minnesota. And so you can imagine the monitor, as you see, the strangest craft a sailor's eyes had ever looked upon, comes next to this frigate. And now just think this frigate is 40 some feet above the water's edge. The monitor is 10 feet above the water's edge. So you can well imagine Van Brunt looked down and as William Keeler will say, the idea of assistance or protection being offered to the huge thing by the little pygmy at her side seemed absolutely ridiculous. One of the Minnesota crew members says, insignificant she looked, but she had a speck on the dark blue sky at night, almost laughable object by day. Now, Van Brunt, when, of course, the monitor shows up, Worden and his executive officer, Samuel Dana Green, they hail the Minnesota. Van Brunt looks down. What are you? And Worden says, I'm the monitor. I'm here to protect you. And Van Brunt went, really? And so they go up and talk to Van Brunt. Van Brunt says, look, if that monster comes back tomorrow morning, I will fight my ship and I will sink before surrender. I'm going to try to get off this sandbank at high tide at about 2 o'clock. Well, every effort to get the ship off of the sandbank fails. They throw off guns, they throw off all sorts of material, the tugs strain, but they just can't do anything. I mean, this ship is really run aground. So basically, the object of the monitor was to keep the Virginia off of the Minnesota. Now, the day begins with the Virginia slowed down because of fog on Hampton Roads. And so then about 8 o'clock, she'll move into the harbor. They see the Minnesota and they see this, what looks like a barge next to it. So the first shot of the battle is fired. A shell screams through the rigging of the Minnesota from a 7-inch Brook gun. And then another shot screams into the Minnesota, going into the engineer's wardroom, bouncing off a beam, and then ending up starting a fire near the magazine. Wow. And so everyone on the Minnesota knows we're done for. However, remember, Worden said, I'm here to protect you, and I will. So basically, the Battle of Hampton Roads is fought in concentric circles, all to save the Minnesota. Now, the Minnesota, every so often, would fire a broadside. The crew members of the monitor said, well, they hit us, which you can't really prove. But anyway, the Minnesota, sometimes during the battle, like the monitor has to break off action, the Virginia goes towards the Minnesota, but runs aground. Oh my gosh. Then she gets off. She then fights the monitor a little more. The monitor has an evasive action. Virginia goes after the Minnesota again. And this brings us to 11:30 and the end of the battle. Now, the Minnesota is obviously saved by this. Now, this is an incorrect scene, but a very good scene nonetheless. I say it's incorrect because that is the 10-inch pivot gun. They had one aft and one forward, and This has an entire African American crew, all who had mustered in Charlestown Navy Yard. Their name is Pivot Gun Crew William Brown, Charles Johnson, George Moore, George H. Roberts, George Sales, William H. White, and Henry Williams. They are going to be part of this battle in a major way. Actually, Van Brunt is so surprised at their service that he will actually note that these men served with greater fervor and determination than all other gun crews. It was because they knew they were there to deliver their race from enslavement. And Van Brunt just lauds them. And so this is kind of a nice picture, but then again, what can I see? There's the Minnesota again in the background. But after the 4 hours of combat, the monitor will be damaged. It's pilot house, Virginia, tide's going out, goes back to Elizabeth River, and the Minnesota is saved. Now, during this battle, I'm going to tell you how close it is. There's a tug right next to the a tug known as the USS Dragon right next to the Minnesota, trying to pull her off the mud. And so when the Virginia comes after the Minnesota the second time, they send a shell which goes through the boilers of the Dragon. Dragon kind of sends steam throughout the ship and sinks. So just think if that shot had gone into the Minnesota, the times would have been far different. But they're not. And I did it again. Oh, well. Tim, I failed again, but I don't know how to reset it. So anyway, well, what happens to the Minnesota afterwards is she will stay in Hampton Roads. Actually, she has 6 members that participate in the siege of Suffolk in May through the end of April 1863. Actually, 4 of their crew members are going to receive the Medal of Honor when they are working on the working with the USS Mount Washington, and they fight at the Battle of Norfleet House, also known as the Battle of Chuckatuck Creek. Okay, so I didn't know they knew there was a battle there. They received the Medal of Honor. Okay? So the big thing is that the Minnesota is going to be attacked on April 9, 1864 by the CSS Squib. Now, the Squib, of course, was called a torpedo boat, and it had a beam of 6 feet. It had a steam engine. It was kind of a scary thing to go in, and so the ship actually had a draft of 3 feet, right? And it had a spar torpedo, and it was reasonably fast. We think it went 9 knots.
I don't know what's up.
Yeah, it doesn't like me. So it was commanded by this man, Henry Davidson, who had worked with mines and so forth, electronic torpedoes. This is what the Squib looked like. We have a spar torpedo. So the concept was, we're going to take that boat at night, run it right towards the larger frigate, and we're going to blow a hole in her. Yeah, just think of that. So what's going to transpire? Now, this is open cockpit, right? It's 1-inch boilerplate. So if you get seen when you're coming, you're going to be blown out of the water. But they don't. They think it's a rowboat coming from another ship. So even though it's a steamer, so it comes, and right when it nears the Minnesota, they'll start shooting at it with muskets, trying to get a cannon to depress itself. And so Davison rams his spar torpedo. Now, the thing is, it's only containing 53 pounds of gunpowder. Plus, it was designed to go in at 6 feet below the waterline. The trouble is that wasn't deep enough. So the torpedo went off and damaged the Minnesota. When that torpedo went off, I'll tell you, there's this huge splash of water, and the squib almost sinks. And, however, it engine stops. So just think you're there and they're shooting at you, but somehow they get the engine going and they escape. So the Minnesota survives what could have been a terrible circumstance. Now, the Minnesota then will participate in the first and second attacks on Fort Fisher. It is during the second attack on Fort Fisher, which begins on January 13, 1865, that we will see that the Federals they start bombarding the fort. Then the commander of the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron at that time is David Dixon Porter, and he hates the Army. And so he wants to capture Fort Fisher through the Navy, so that he knows the Army is going to come up this narrow, it's from Carolina Beach. And so he organizes an attack of 1,400 Marines and Blue Jackets, right, to land and attack. There's a stockade fence right below the Pulpit Battery, which is supposed to stop a landing doing a direct attack. So that thing's still standing. So Porter will tell his men, oh, we're going to take that fort by boarding, and we only need cutlasses and pistols. Wasn't a good thought. And 240 members of the crew of the Minnesota had volunteered to be part of it. 9 of them received the Medal of Honor. So, and this was a failed, stupid attack. But if you know, I just did a lecture for you all on David Dixon Porter. You can start to understand his ego got in the way quite often. So the Minnesota, well, this doesn't love me. The Minnesota will be commissioned right after the war, 16 February 1865, goes in ordinary. Then she's brought out of ordinary at Charlestown Navy Yard, and she will then do a cruise with midshipmen. She'll be placed in ordinary again in 13 January 1868 at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Then Stephen Luce, who's the founder of the Naval War College in Newport, pulls that ship out of ordinary and has it recommissioned, and it serves as a floating classroom for him. And at the end of his command of the Minnesota, you'll see the establishment of the Naval War College. So 1883, on 24 May, can you imagine the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge and what ship sailed under it as the opening of the dedication ceremonies? All her sails, her signal flags are all in evidence as she declares the Brooklyn Bridge to be open. There's a big step. They picked the Minnesota because it was there. It's a big ship. However, as soon as it does this great dedication, it's placed in ordinary. And then all of a sudden, in October of 1895, it is loaned to, believe it or not, the Massachusetts State Naval Militia. Okay, we want to defend our coast, and so it stays with the state militia until 1901, when it will be sold for scrap, and it will be sent up to Eastport, Maine, where they'll burn it for its iron fittings. And that is the inglorious end of the Minnesota. Now, what makes the Minnesota such an important ship? Well, number one, it is a new type of technology introduced into the Navy. It is proven to be a failure because of its deep draft, its poor engines, and many of the ships. Minnesota never has its engines reworked. So it and the Wabash had the right contractors, whereas the other ships did not. The Roanoke ship, actually, when they have to put a new engine in it, they make it into an ironclad. So the long and short of it, Minnesota is there when we start our blockade. It captures 20 blockade runners in 3 months. Amazing record when you think about it. And it's all because it was steam powered. Now, then it participates in the first amphibious operation of the Civil War with the capture of Hatteras Inlet. It plays a critical role in the change of naval strategy for bombarding coastal defense forts by this circulus route that it took. Actually, Stringham stole that from the British, but that's okay. It's the first time in America will be used. The Minnesota, of course, is part of the Great Battle of Hampton Roads, where it is the target of the CSS Virginia, and only the Monitor is able to keep the Confederate ironclad away from its supposed target. Because, the Virginia was designed to fight wooden ships, not another ironclad. And actually, they had armor-piercing shot, but it was up in Richmond, and so the two ironclads couldn't really deal with each other. And the Minnesota, despite all the confusion, it was damaged, but it still was able to survive. That's in part why the Monitor is given the great thing or name known as the little ship that saved the nation. But the Minnesota was there. The Minnesota will also be there when they test the power of spar torpedoes and torpedo boats on 9 April 1864, and when the squib attacks it. When they ram the Minnesota, I forgot to tell you, Hunter Davison pulls the lanyard, then fires a shotgun into the Minnesota, and that's when the waves it almost sinks the ship right away. But he's very stealthily, they go and hide in the Pagan River and then make it up the James River. Well, I think the lesson to us all is that it also participates in the last amphibious operation of the war, the capture of Fort Fisher in January of 1865. And it also shows that these warships, because of the size of their crew, the Minnesota has a crew and officers, 649 men. Okay, so they get to take people off that to actually have land operations. Of course, in the case of Fort Fisher, that was not successful. But the Minnesota, being an archaic vessel, as the Civil War progresses, will still stay useful to the U.S. Navy until it is scrapped in 1901. So that is the story of the USS Minnesota. Any questions? Yes. Oh, back there.
This is a question about sort of the battle of Hampton Roads. The Minnesota's got a 20-foot draft. The Merrimack is
a 23-foot draft.
Merrimack is of a similar class.
22 feet.
How about Monitor?
Monitor has a draft of 11 feet.
So it can,
So it can go wherever it wants, pretty much in Hampton Roads. The big thing is that the Minnesota did not have a proper pilot, right? If you are a pilot in Hampton Roads, what team do you want to serve on? Well, the Confederates, right? And so not having a proper pilot results in that ship running aground. Plus, they're in a rush. Van Brunt had his battle blood up, and he knows he has to go and bombard that ironclad. And in such a rush, that's why they try to clip the bar off of Newport News Point, or right before you get to Newport News Point. And that's why it runs aground, and it really runs aground. It doesn't get off of the shoal until 2 days later. So had no monitor been there, there would be no Minnesota.
All right. One of our listeners would like to know is there any Minnesota Minnesota artifacts in the Mariners Museum?
We sadly do not have any. And to my knowledge anyway, and we don't have any objects from any of its commanders. So, but it's a archaic ship that plays a big role, bigger than its technology. Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
So you said that they kept laying these ships back up. They made the trip over to China, came back, they put it out of service.
Okay, they did that. Now the question is, why did after a cruise did they decommission warships? Well, number one, a 2-year long cruise to the Orient causes stress and strain on your ship. I mean, there is no doubt about it. And as a result of that, it needs repairs. So the Navy, being parsimonious, excuse me, that went down the wrong pipe. So anyway, they put it in ordinary, not worry about it. Then when they knew they needed it, they'd bring it out of ordinary and fix it all up, and phew, out to sea it would go. Falling apart up here, all because my clicker didn't work. So that's why. And sometimes it's because the ship needed a lot of repair. And so the shipyards, like the Gosport Navy Yard, really did not have an active commander right before the war. So they were slow in making these repairs and things like that. So anybody else?
All right. Somebody else asked, did the davits on the CSS Virginia have enough reach to clear the angle of the casemate?
Yes, they did not have davits like you think. The lifeboats or ship's boats were actually on a cradle, iron cradle, attached to the sloped casemate. And they were within reach of seamen to actually come down and pull it up and then put people in it and drop it into the water. Remember, you have about a 9-foot drop. So that's like using a davit, but they had railings, but they did not have the traditional davits. They probably would have put them on there, but you have to realize the Minnesota or the Monitor, Virginia, was in a rush to get into Hampton Roads because they knew the Monitor was coming. And in fact, the New York Times let them know on March 6, 1862, when they said, oh, the Monitor left New York today. Destination, Hampton Roads. Oh, great. Yeah. So that was, there's no secrets during the Civil War. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What design changes came about after
Well, they would not build any steam screw frigates anymore. They finished a couple that they'd already laid down, mostly very modified. The Navy goes through a period where we don't want to build any ships. They actually figured out that the better ship was the steam screw sloops of the Hartford class because they had a lesser draft. They had better engine systems, or most of them did. And so we realize that the use of coal was so exorbitant that it wasn't really worth it to operate the ships but under sail. So, and yet we decided, well, we built all these monitors and everything. We're not going to build any more warships. So it's not until the 1880s that we start going to build armored, protected cruisers. Okay. I hope that answered your question. Yes, sir.
This is a general question. So they all use coal. How about in the Mississippi? Did they use coal there, or did they use wood for their steam engines? I mean, what's the game?
They use coal.
So they haul coal around.
Yes.
Coal became a big
A coal is easy to get. You just send it down the Ohio River, boom. And there are coal deposits in Minnesota and other places. So coal was the better substance. But I'll tell you, railroads at first used wood. In fact, that's why you see all these little railroad towns that after we have diesel locomotives, you don't need those little towns anymore. So, but they were all coal powered. Any other?
Nobody seems to have any. Let me double check.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all very much for excuse me for my inabilities with technology, despite assistance from everybody. But I guess you got the very much of the story. The thing of the Minnesota, I have to tell you, is that it is a key element of the Battle of Hampton Roads. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.